My name is Melissa Grant. I am 29 years old, and 3 hours ago, I was a captain in the United States Army Logistics Corps who had just spent 14 months managing $20 million supply chains across the rugged terrain of Poland. But as I lay paralyzed on the gleaming oil-rubbed surface of a $14,500 Brazilian wood deck, I was nothing more than a social embarrassment to the woman who gave me birth. "Shake it off, Melissa, you are fine, just stop being so dramatic and get up because people are actually watching," my mother, Evelyn, hissed under her breath, her voice carrying that specific sharp edge of Savannah high society panic that prioritized the guest list over the fact that her eldest daughter's legs had suddenly turned to lead. The humidity of a Georgia July hung heavy and thick like a wet wool blanket, smelling of expensive citronella candles and the $300 an hour catering team's Wagyu sliders, yet all I could focus on was the terrifying silence in my own nervous system while the world blurred around the edges of my vision. I could see the condensation dripping down a condensation-slicked glass of Veuve Clicquot perched on a nearby wrought iron table, a tiny rivulet of water carving a path through the frost, and I wondered if my career in the military had finally caught up with me in the most pathetic way possible, collapsing amidst a sea of pastel linen suits and pearl necklaces. My mother's shadow loomed over me, a silhouette of perfectly tailored silk and a salon-fresh blowout that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. And instead of reaching down to check my pulse or look into my eyes for signs of a stroke, she adjusted her gold Cartier tank watch and glanced nervously toward the mayor's wife who was sipping a gin and tonic 10 feet away. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the life I had known for the last year, where a fall meant a medic, a siren, and a brotherhood that didn't care about the optics of a bruised ego. But here in the zip code of 31401, a daughter's physical collapse was merely a breach of etiquette that threatened the carefully curated narrative of the Grant family's summer gala. I tried to speak, to tell her that my left side felt like it had been injected with liquid nitrogen, but my tongue felt heavy and useless against my teeth, a silent prisoner in a body that had survived mortar threats only to be defeated by a homecoming party. But I am getting ahead of myself, and perhaps I should take you back to the moment I stepped off the plane at Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport, clutching my duffel bag with a sense of relief that I now realize was entirely premature. I had spent months dreaming of the quiet oak trees draped in Spanish moss and the slow rhythmic pace of the South, imagining that my service would finally earn me a seat at the table where I wasn't just the disappointing daughter who chose boots over ballet slippers. I had sent home nearly 80% of my deployment pay to help with the renovations on this very house, wiring thousands of dollars from a dusty office in Poznan to ensure the contractors used the highest grade of mahogany and the most durable weather stripping. Yet as I lay there, my face pressed against the expensive wood I had financed, I realized that to my mother, I was just a piece of faulty equipment that was ruining the aesthetic of her evening. The guests continued to chatter, their laughter sounding like breaking glass in my ears, while my sister, the golden child who had never left the county line, stood in the doorway of the French doors with a look of disgusted pity on her face. I was a logistics expert who could move an entire battalion across a continent, but I couldn't figure out how to move my own fingers 2 inches across the deck boards. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, the crushing weight of family injustice felt heavier than any rucksack I had ever carried through the mud. "Use your muscles, Melissa. It is just a bit of heat exhaustion," Evelyn whispered, her heels clicking impatiently against the wood right next to my ear, a sound that signaled her transition from motherly concern to social damage control. I closed my eyes, the smell of her Jo Malone perfume mixing with the metallic scent of my own fear, realizing that the war I had just returned from was nothing compared to the one that was just beginning in my own backyard. Family isn't blood, I would eventually learn, but in that moment blood was all I had, and it was currently failing to reach my brain while my mother worried about the carpet. The contrast was sickening as I looked up from the grain of the wood, catching a glimpse of my sister, Samantha, who stood there like a centerpiece in a lifestyle magazine while I felt like a discarded prop. At 32, Samantha had perfected the art of existing as a professional daughter, hosting my welcome home party in a $350 floral Reformation midi dress that draped perfectly over her frame, her fingers adorned with a stack of gold rings that caught the afternoon sun. She held her chilled glass of Veuve Clicquot with a practiced elegance, the bubbles rising in the crystal flute as she looked down at me not with concern, but with the mild irritation one might feel toward a spilled drink on a white rug. I had arrived at this house driving my 10-year-old silver Toyota Corolla with 140,000 miles on the odometer and a rattling heat shield, wearing a $45 pair of Levi's 500 ones and a simple navy blouse from Target that I'd ironed in a rush at a roadside motel. While I had spent the last 14 months in Poland survived on gritty MREs, lukewarm bottled water, and the constant low-thrumming stress of coordinating million-dollar supply chains under operational pressure, Samantha had been navigating the high-stakes world of yoga retreats and brunch reservations. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that while I was wiring thousands of dollars of my deployment pay back home to help my parents maintain the facade of this estate, they were quietly funneling $2,800 every single month to cover Samantha's luxury apartment rent in the downtown historic district. Just last quarter, my father had sat me down over a grainy Skype call to discuss family contributions and the rising cost of property taxes, never mentioning that he had just written a check for $12,000 to wipe out Samantha's spiraling credit card debt at Nordstrom and Anthropologie. I watched her now, the golden child who hadn't held a real job in 3 years, as she leaned over to whisper something to her boyfriend, a man wearing a $500 Peter Miller polo who probably couldn't point to Poland on a map. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in my chest, more suffocating than the Georgia humidity or the neurological static currently numbing my legs. I was a captain in the United States Army, a woman who had managed the logistics for an entire battalion, yet in this backyard I was the daughter who was difficult and too intense, while Samantha was the delicate flower who needed to be protected from the harsh realities of a bank balance. She took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the crowd of guests to ensure no one was recording my embarrassing display on their iPhones, her priority clearly being the preservation of the Grant family brand rather than the health of her only sister. I looked at the frayed hem of my jeans, the fabric worn from years of honest use, and then back at her pristine, expensive sandals, realizing that the gap between us wasn't just measured in miles or career paths, but in a fundamental lack of respect that no amount of military service could ever bridge. My mother continued to hover, her presence a toxic mix of social anxiety and perfume, while Samantha simply turned her back to me to engage the mayor's wife in a conversation about the upcoming charity auction at the yacht club. I was the one who had faced the cold winds of Eastern Europe and the crushing responsibility of soldiers' lives, yet I was treated like a burden by the people who shared my DNA, while the sister who couldn't even manage her own electricity bill was celebrated as the pinnacle of the family's success. This was the reality of my homecoming, a sharp reminder that loyalty in this family was a one-way street paved with my hard-earned money and their bottomless demands. Family isn't about who shares your last name. It is about who sees you when you are at your lowest and decides to reach down instead of looking away to check the guest list. The betrayal happened at exactly 4:22 p.m., a moment frozen in the humid Georgia air as the sunlight caught the edges of the heavy silver serving tray I was carrying from the kitchen. My mother, Evelyn, had insisted that I make myself useful by bringing out a fresh set of 12 crystal Waterford glasses, each valued at over $180, as if my 14 months of military service were merely a temporary hiatus from my true calling as her unpaid domestic help. As I transitioned from the cool, air-conditioned slate of the gourmet kitchen onto the scorching surface of the new deck, my rugged, thousand-mile-worn tactical boots hit a localized patch of clear, industrial-grade silicone spray that had been slicked across the threshold like a professional trap. There was no traction, no warning, and no chance to recover my balance as my feet flew out from under me, launching my body into a violent arc while the tray of crystal shattered against the doorframe like a volley of small arms fire. My spine collided with the sharp, unforgiving edge of a $200 per plank Brazilian wood step with a sickening wet crack that echoed louder in my ears than the gasp of the 30 socialites gathered on the lawn. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, replaced by a high-pitched ringing and a terrifying, cold void where my lower body used to be, leaving me pinned against the expensive timber like a broken butterfly in a display case. As I lay there, gasping for air that tasted of copper and expensive mulch, Samantha stepped over the threshold, her $350 floral Reformation dress fluttering in the breeze as she looked down at me with a predatory, cold-blooded smirk that never reached her eyes. She didn't reach for a phone to call 911 or even offer a hand to steady my shaking shoulders. Instead, she leaned down just far enough so only I could hear her voice, whispering with a jagged, cruel delight, "Maybe you should have worn better shoes, Captain, or maybe you just aren't as tough as the Army told you you were." The physical agony of my vertebrae was nothing compared to the sharp, icy realization that my own sister had likely watched me walk into that trap, or perhaps even set it herself to ensure the war hero, was properly humbled before the elite of Savannah. My father, Richard, didn't rush to my side either. He didn't check my pupils for signs of shock or ask if I could feel my toes. Instead, he stood 3 feet away, his face turning a mottled shade of puce as he looked at the jagged shards of crystal and the spilled Chardonnay. He began to complain loudly to anyone who would listen about how the shattered glass might scratch the new oil-rubbed finish of the deck and how the acidic wine would surely stain the wood I had spent my deployment pay to install. I was a logistics officer who had managed the movements of entire battalions through hostile territory, yet here I was, paralyzed on a luxury porch while my father worried about the aesthetics of a plank and my sister gloated over my shattered spine. The guests stared with a mix of horror and morbid curiosity, their hushed whispers swirling around me like the gnats in the heavy summer air, while I remained pinned to the ipe wood, a captain of the United States Army who had survived the front lines only to be crippled by the pettiness of her own bloodline. The smell of the silicone spray was unmistakable now, a chemical, artificial scent that cut through the aroma of the catering, a smoking gun that no one cared to investigate because it was easier to blame the clumsy daughter in the cheap jeans. In that moment of absolute stillness, as the realization of my paralysis began to sink in, I understood that I was never a guest at this party. I was the entertainment, a cautionary tale designed to make Samantha look more graceful by comparison. Family isn't a safety net. Sometimes it is the very thing that cuts the rope while you are climbing, and as the sun began to dip behind the oak trees, I realized that the hardest battle of my life wasn't fought in a foreign land, but right here on the polished mahogany of a house that my own sacrifice had built. The interior of the LifeMed ambulance was a sterile, claustrophobic contrast to the humid, floral-scented nightmare of the backyard gala, lit by the harsh, flickering hum of blue-white fluorescent tubes that made my skin look as gray as the smoke over a Polish motor pool. The silence in the back of the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the uneven asphalt of Abercorn Street and the metallic rattle of the medical equipment in their wall-mounted brackets. A paramedic named Miller, whose name tag was slightly crooked over his navy blue uniform, kept leaning into my field of vision with a penlight and a look of professional concern that was more genuine than anything I had seen from my own blood kin in the last decade. He kept asking me to wiggle my toes, his voice a low, steady murmur against the siren's distant wail. But as I stared down at the scuffed toes of my $45 boots, my lower body felt like it belonged to a plastic mannequin, a heavy and unresponsive weight that had been crudely stitched to my torso. I didn't cry because tears were a luxury I had traded for survival years ago in the motor pools and mud-slicked trenches of Eastern Europe, and instead, I lay there with my neck immobilized in a rigid plastic brace, staring at the ceiling and realizing with a cold, crystalline clarity that my family did not see a daughter, a protector, or even a decorated Army logistics captain. To Evelyn and Richard Grant, I was merely a nuisance, a tactical error in their social strategy that had threatened to stain the $14,500 deck I had personally financed with my combat pay. My mind, trained for efficiency and the tracking of every single nut and bolt in a $1 million supply chain, began to execute a cold clinical mental checklist of every dime I had ever wired home to Savannah. I calculated the $18,000 for the kitchen's Italian marble countertops, the $6,000 for the custom HVAC system, and the endless stream of $400 wire transfers I had sent to Samantha whenever she forgot to pay her Georgia Power bill or needed a new dress for a charity polo match. I thought about the predatory smirk on Samantha's face as I lay broken on the Brazilian ipe wood, the way her $350 Reformation dress caught the light while she whispered her insults, and I realized that every lie she had ever told to my parents about my instability, or her own entrepreneurial efforts, had been a calculated move to secure her status as the golden child. The warmth of familial love had been extinguished in the time it took for my spine to hit that mahogany step, replaced by the icy familiar vacuum of a combat mission where the objectives were clear and the sentiment was a liability. I wasn't just a victim of a slip-and-fall accident. I was a soldier who had finally identified the enemy, and they weren't wearing foreign uniforms or speaking another language, but were sipping Veuve Clicquot in a backyard I had paid for while I was being rushed toward St. Joseph's Hospital with a possible spinal cord injury. As the ambulance took a sharp turn, causing the equipment to jingle like loose shell casings, I stopped being the daughter who sought approval and became the captain who sought justice, cataloging every financial betrayal and every psychological wound with the precision of a quartermaster. The mission had changed from reconciliation to total recovery and reclamation. and as the sirens screamed through the quiet streets of the historic district, I felt a strange, terrifying peace settle over me because once the love is gone, only the mission remains, and I have never failed a mission in my life. Family isn't a bond of blood when that blood is cold enough to leave you paralyzed on a porch for the sake of appearances. Family is a contract, and my parents and sister had just breached every single clause. 3 weeks later, the Savannah heat still shimmered off the pavement, but I was viewing the world from a seated position in a $4,500 Permobile M3 Corpus Power wheelchair that hummed with a low, electric clinical precision as I navigated the mahogany-paneled corridors of Marcus Thorne's law office. The air inside the suite smelled of expensive Italian leather, $80 an ounce Jamaican Blue Mountain espresso, and the sharp metallic scent of high-stakes litigation that Marcus wore like a bespoke suit. Marcus Thorne was not a man of small gestures. He sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, his fingers steepled as he reviewed the files I had meticulously organized during my recovery at St. Joseph's Hospital. I was no longer the daughter seeking a place at the dinner table. I was a captain in the United States Army Logistics Corps conducting a forensic audit of a betrayal, and we weren't just filing a standard personal injury claim, we were preparing for a scorched earth campaign against the people who shared my DNA. I had pulled what I called the black box of my life, a digital fortress of evidence containing 14 months of bank statements and encrypted wire transfer receipts that told a story of systematic financial abuse. There was the $15,000 transfer I had sent from a dusty terminal in Poland, earmarked specifically for a catastrophic roof leak at my parents' estate, which my records now proved had been instantly rerouted to cover Samantha's 6-day luxury bender in Cabo San Lucas, complete with 5-star resort stays and a chartered catamaran. Every cent of my combat pay, every hazard duty bonus I had earned while sleeping in a tent, had been treated as a slush fund for Samantha's $350 reformation dresses and her $12,000 credit card bailouts. But the crown jewel of my arsenal was a high-definition 4K video file retrieved from my neighbor's Nest Cam IQ outdoor camera, which had a perfect, unobstructed line of sight over the low boxwood hedge and directly onto the transition between the kitchen and the deck. We watched the footage in the heavy silence of the office, the resolution so sharp I could see the individual bubbles in the champagne glasses on the nearby table. At exactly 4:18 p.m., 4 minutes before my fall, the camera captured Samantha walking onto the deck with a canister of heavy-duty industrial silicone spray, the kind used for lubricating garage door tracks to ensure a frictionless surface. With a calm, methodical hand, she coated the exact threshold where she knew I would be stepping with a heavy tray of crystal, her face a mask of cold, calculated intent as she tucked the canister into a decorative planter before smoothing her floral dress and walking back inside. There was no ambiguity, no accidental spill, and no room for the excuses my father had been practicing in his frantic voicemails to my hospital room. Marcus leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning shot, and I felt a surge of cold, tactical satisfaction that overrode the phantom itching in my unfeeling legs. I had spent my career ensuring that every resource reached its destination and every threat was accounted for, and now my family was the primary target in a logistical takedown they never saw coming. They thought I was a broken soldier they could discard into the machinery of the state, but they forgot that I knew exactly how to track a trail of breadcrumbs, whether they were crates of ammunition or stolen thousands of dollars. As the sun set over the Savannah River, casting long, jagged shadows across the office floor, I realized that my wheelchair wasn't a cage. It was a mobile command center from which I would dismantle the facade of the Grant family piece by piece. Family is supposed to be the ground you stand on, but when they turn that ground into a trap for their own profit, you don't just walk away, you burn the bridge and reclaim every single brick. The mission was no longer about survival, it was about a total, uncompromising accounting of the truth. And with Marcus Thorne as my vanguard, the war for my dignity had officially moved from the backyard to the courtroom. The footage was the definitive smoking gun that transformed a tragic accident into a calculated crime scene, played out in high-definition clarity on Marcus Thorne's 65-inch monitor. At exactly 3:14 p.m., while I was likely upstairs struggling to pull on my $45 Levi's and fighting the lingering fatigue of a transatlantic flight, the neighbor's Nest Cam captured Samantha stepping out onto the transition between the kitchen and the $14,500 Brazilian Ipewood deck. She wasn't carrying a drink or a decoration, but instead she held a 12-ounce aerosol can of heavy-duty sliding door lubricant, a professional-grade silicone spray designed to eliminate friction on the heaviest of industrial tracks. With a chilling, methodical focus that lacked even a hint of hesitation, she knelt down and specifically saturated a 2-foot section of the threshold right at the top of the stairs, the very spot she knew I would have to traverse while carrying the heavy Waterford crystal. I watched, my knuckles white as I gripped the armrests of my Permobile M3 power wheelchair, as my sister pulled a yellow microfiber cloth from her pocket and began to buff the lubricant into the wood, polishing the surface until the sun hit it just right and the trap became a completely invisible death zone. There was no room for the clumsiness narrative my mother had been peddling to the neighbors or the heat exhaustion theory my father used to deflect responsibility for the shattered glass. This wasn't a sibling prank gone wrong or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a 32-year-old woman committing what any prosecutor would define as aggravated assault with a premeditated intent to cause grievous bodily harm. She stood up after finishing her work, checking her reflection in the glass of the French doors and smoothing the fabric of her $350 floral Reformation dress with a look of smug, quiet satisfaction before retreating back into the house to wait for the show to begin. The precision of her actions mirrored the very logistics training I had mastered in the Army, except her objective wasn't the delivery of supplies but the structural failure of her own sister's spine. Marcus paused the video on a frame where Samantha's face was turned toward the camera, her expression devoid of the golden child innocence she wore like a mask, revealing instead a predatory coldness that made the air-conditioned office feel like a meat locker. As a logistics captain, I had seen maps of minefields and reports of IED placements, but seeing a trap laid in my own childhood home by my own blood was a betrayal that no military manual could ever prepare me for. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the computer fans and the distant sound of Savannah traffic, as the reality of her malice settled into the marrow of my bones. She had calculated the trajectory, she had selected the lubricant for its transparency, and she had timed it perfectly to ensure that when I launched off that deck, the impact would be maximum. I realized then that while I was defending interests halfway across the globe, the real enemy had been occupying the bedroom next to mine, whispering lies and polishing the floor for my demise. My family had treated my deployment pay like a communal bank account, but Samantha had treated my very life like a balance sheet she was determined to clear. This footage wasn't just evidence for a personal injury claim. It was the foundation for a criminal indictment that would strip the silk from her back and the smirk from her face. I looked at the frozen image of her buffing the wood and felt the last remnants of my familial loyalty evaporate into the sterile office air, replaced by a cold, tactical resolve to ensure that every second of that recording was used to dismantle the comfortable, fraudulent life she had built on the back of my sacrifice. The mission had reached a point of no return, and as Marcus began typing the initial draft of the complaint, I knew that the invisible trap she set for me was about to become the very thing that ensnared her for the rest of her life. Family isn't a refuge when the person holding the door is the one who oiled the floor. It is a battlefield, and I was finally bringing the heavy artillery home. The final briefing took place exactly 2 months after my spine hit that Brazilian Ipe wood, on a Saturday afternoon when the Savannah sun was beating down with a merciless intensity that seemed to highlight every flaw in the Grant family facade. My parents, never ones to let a tragedy interfere with their social calendar, were hosting a lavish deck warming party for 40 of their most elite country club friends, the kind of people who measured worth in zip codes and the vintage of their wine. I rolled up to the curb of my childhood home not in my rattling old Toyota, but in a matte black modified Chevrolet Tahoe with a wheelchair lift that hummed with a low, predatory mechanical whine as it lowered me to the pavement. I was dressed in my full Army Class A uniform, the fabric crisp and heavy against my skin, my silver captain's bars and my campaign medals from Poland gleaming like polished bayonets under the Georgia sky. I wasn't there for the catering or the forced smiles of people who had whispered about my clumsiness behind their linen napkins. I was there to execute a tactical strike that would dismantle their comfortable world of lies. Standing beside me was my former staff sergeant Tyler Brooks, a man who had stood with me through supply chain ambushes in Eastern Europe and who now carried a heavy stack of 40 identical manila envelopes with a grim, professional stoicism. As we reached the edge of that $14,500 deck, the very stage where my sister had oiled the floor for my demise, the air was filled with the tinkling of ice in crystal glasses and the pretentious laughter of the Savannah elite. I didn't wait for an invitation or a greeting from my mother, who was currently laughing at a joke made by the local bank president while wearing a new set of pearl earrings that I had likely paid for with my hazard pay. "Attention," I barked, using the razor-sharp command voice that used to move entire battalions across borders and silence the chaos of a logistics yard. A sound so sudden and authoritative that it sliced through the atmosphere like a physical blade. The music, a soft jazz track playing through hidden Bose speakers, seemed to die mid-note as 40 heads turned in unison toward the woman in the wheelchair who looked like she was ready to court-martial the entire zip code. My mother's glass of Veuve Clicquot hovered inches from her lips, her eyes widening with a mixture of embarrassment and rising panic as she saw the medals on my chest and the cold, dead light in my eyes. Samantha stood near the outdoor kitchen, her $350 Reformation dress fluttering in the breeze, her face turning a sickly shade of ash as she realized that the broken sister she thought she had discarded was back with reinforcements. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower 3 houses away and the heavy rhythmic breathing of Staff Sergeant Brooks as he waited for my next signal. I scanned the crowd, noting the mayor's wife and the influential developers who funded my father's business ventures, and I felt a surge of icy, tactical satisfaction knowing that the mission was now live and there was no retreating from the truth. I hadn't come for an apology or a tearful reconciliation that would never happen. I had come to deliver a briefing that would ensure that by sunset, the name Grant would be synonymous with betrayal rather than prestige. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but for me, it had become a target of interest that required a total, uncompromising disclosure of every stolen dollar and every calculated act of malice. As I prepared to signal Brooks to begin the distribution of the envelopes, I looked directly at Samantha and saw the first flicker of genuine terror in her eyes, a look that told me she finally understood that I was no longer playing the role of the victim. The war that began on this very wood was about to reach its terminal phase, and in my world, when the captain calls for attention, the world stops to listen to the wreckage. Every guest held their breath as the weight of my military presence occupied the space, transforming the gala into a parade ground where the only currency was the cold, hard facts contained in those manila folders. This was the moment of total accountability, and as I drew a breath of the humid air, I knew that the foundation of their lives was about to crumble under the weight of the evidence I had spent 2 months meticulously preparing. I did not yell or scream because in the theater of high-stakes logistics, the most devastating weapon is always the unvarnished truth. So I kept my voice as level and cold as a winter morning in the Carpathian Mountains while I looked directly into the eyes of the 40 socialites who had come to celebrate a lie. On June 14th at exactly 3:14 p.m., Samantha Grant walked onto this very transition and applied industrial-grade sliding door lubricant to a 2-foot section of this wood deck with the sole intent of causing a catastrophic fall, I announced, my words hanging in the humid savanna air like a physical weight that made the guests shift uncomfortably in their linen suits and silk dresses. At my silent nod, Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks began to move through the crowd with a disciplined, rhythmic efficiency, handing out the heavy manila envelopes to the mayor, the bank president, and the various country club trustees whose opinions my parents valued more than my own life. Inside each envelope was a high-resolution, color-corrected still frame from the neighbor's Nest cam showing Samantha in her $350 Reformation dress, kneeling over the wood with a 12-ounce can of silicone spray and a microfiber cloth, caught in a moment of premeditated malice that no amount of Southern charm could ever explain away. Alongside the photograph was a formal copy of the $2.4 million personal injury and financial fraud lawsuit that my attorney Marcus Thorne had served to my parents' legal counsel only 20 minutes prior, a document that detailed every stolen wire transfer and every medical bill that had piled up while I lay in a hospital bed. I raised my hand and pointed with a steady, gloved finger to the exact spot on the deck where the sunlight hit the polished wood, the very spot where my spine had snapped while they worried about the wine stains on the $14,500 timber I had financed. This perfect family home that you are all admiring today was built on the foundation of my stolen deployment savings, maintained by the hazard pay I earned in a war zone, and ultimately christened by the sound of my bones breaking on the steps. I continued, my voice gaining a razor-sharp edge that caused my mother to drop her crystal glass, the sound of it shattering against the Brazilian wood echoing the fall that had ended my career. I watched the faces of the guests as they pulled the photographs from the envelopes, their expressions shifting from confusion to a visceral, wide-eyed horror as they realized they were standing on a crime scene orchestrated by the woman currently clutching a designer clutch and trying to find the words to lie. Samantha attempted to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the evidence in 40 different pairs of hands was an absolute, undeniable blockade against her usual manipulation. My father stood frozen near the outdoor grill, his face a pale, sickly mask of realization that his reputation, his social standing, and his daughter's future had all been liquidated in a single afternoon of exposure. I didn't need their apologies or their frantic excuses because I was a captain who had just completed the final phase of a reclamation mission, stripping away their dignity with the same clinical precision they had used to strip away my health. The silence on the deck was no longer one of polite conversation but the heavy, suffocating silence of a funeral for a reputation. And as I sat in my permobile wheelchair at the head of the stairs, I realized that the mission was finally complete. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary of trust, but when that sanctuary is revealed to be a slaughterhouse of greed and betrayal, the only honorable response is to burn the facade to the ground and walk away with the truth as your only companion. I signaled to Tyler that we were finished, and as we turned to leave the stunned crowd behind, I felt the cold, hard weight of justice settling into my chest, a feeling far more permanent and satisfying than the hollow approval of a family that never deserved my sacrifice. This was the end of the Grant family legacy in Savannah, written in the ink of a lawsuit and the clarity of a 4K camera lens, and as the lift on my black SUV began to rise, I knew that for the first time in years, I was truly heading home to a life that belonged only to me. The reaction from the crowd was a masterpiece of social destruction that unfolded in slow motion across the expensive Brazilian ipewood deck, a spectacle of collapsing reputations that felt more satisfying than any military promotion I had ever received in my career. Mrs. Higgins, the self-appointed queen of Savannah's gossip circuit and the woman whose approval my mother had spent decades courting, stood frozen with her mouth agape as she dropped her $15 plate of artisanal hors d'oeuvres, the delicate puff pastries scattering across the polished timber like debris after an explosion. My mother, Margaret, lunged forward with a desperate clawing motion to snatch the manila envelopes from the hands of the nearest guests, her face twisted into a mask of frantic denial, but I simply held up a single, commanding hand that stopped her in her tracks with the sheer weight of my authority. It is all public record now, Margaret, and every single person on this deck is currently holding the proof that you traded your daughter's spine for a fresh coat of stain and a kitchen remodel, I stated, my voice echoing off the French doors with a clinical coldness that silenced her mid-gasp. Samantha had turned a sickly, translucent shade of white that I had only ever seen on the faces of ghosts or soldiers in the deepest throes of shock, her $350 Reformation dress suddenly looking like a cheap shroud as she realized her life of unearned luxury was disintegrating before her eyes. My father, Richard, tried to summon his usual bluster, puffing out his chest and starting a desperate monologue about family loyalty and the sanctity of the Grant name, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and the realization that his professional standing was tied to the very documents now being read by the city's most influential developers. I didn't let him finish his scripted defense of the indefensible, instead reaching into the side pocket of my permobile wheelchair to produce the itemized medical bill for my $88,000 spinal fusion surgery, a document that listed every titanium screw and every hour of intensive care that had been required to keep me from total permanent paralysis. I held the paper up so the sunlight caught the staggering total at the bottom, a figure that represented only a fraction of the physical and emotional debt they owed me for 14 months of stolen wages and a lifetime of being the family's sacrificial lamb. You speak of loyalty while I lay in a hospital bed wondering if I would ever walk again, all while you were busy planning a party to celebrate the very floor that broke me, I countered, watching as the bank president slowly folded the photograph of Samantha and tucked it into his jacket pocket with a look of profound disgust directed at my parents. The guests began to back away from the host and hostess as if their touch were suddenly toxic, the social fabric of the Grant family tearing apart with a soundless, violent finality that no amount of country club prestige could ever repair. I sat there in my classy uniform, the medals on my chest representing a level of honor and sacrifice that no one else in this backyard could even begin to comprehend, and I felt the heavy burden of trying to belong to them finally lift from my shoulders. The $15,000 roof loan that paid for a Cabo trip, the $2,800 monthly rent for a sister who wouldn't even call 911 while I was choking on my own pain, and the industrial lubricant buffed into the wood with a microfiber cloth were all laid bare under the unforgiving Georgia sun. There were no more secrets to keep and no more excuses to make for people who viewed my service as a bank account and my injury as an inconvenience to their social standing. Family is not a bond of blood when that blood is cold enough to leave you for dead for the sake of an aesthetic. It is a contract of mutual respect that they had breached with a calculated, predatory malice. As the first of the guests began to shuffle toward their luxury SUVs in the driveway without even saying goodbye, I realized that I had finally achieved my final objective. I had reclaimed my narrative, my dignity, and the truth, leaving them with nothing but a $2.4 million lawsuit and the echoing silence of a ruined reputation. The fallout from my tactical disclosure was swift and devastating, moving through the upper crust of Savannah society like a shockwave that dismantled 30 years of my parents' social climbing in less than 72 hours of absolute, unmitigated scandal. The ultra-exclusive Savannah Yacht and Country Club, an institution that prioritized discretion above all else, revoked my parents' platinum membership with a formal cold letter delivered via courier to avoid the radioactive fallout of being associated with people who would oil a deck to cripple their own daughter. My father, Richard, found himself sitting in a corner office that suddenly felt like a prison cell when his senior partners at the engineering firm suggested he take an immediate and quiet early retirement after the local news picked up the story under the headline of War Hero Betrayed by Family. The prestigious firm could not risk its reputation for integrity while one of its principals was being sued for $2.4 million for systemic financial fraud and the physical endangerment of a commissioned officer of the United States Army. As for Samantha, her carefully curated world of aesthetic brunch photos and superficial influencer friends vanished the very second they realized she was no longer a social asset but a potential felon with a looming aggravated assault charge over her head. The $2,800 a month luxury apartment in the historic district, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and marble backsplash that I had effectively paid for, was repossessed within the month as my parents' accounts were frozen by the preliminary injunction Marcus Thorne had secured. She was forced to pack her designer wardrobe into cardboard boxes and move into a 400-square-foot studio apartment located directly above a noisy commercial garage on the outskirts of the city. A place where the smell of diesel and the rattle of impact wrenches replaced the scent of Joe Malone and the quiet hum of central air. I watched from the sidelines of my recovery, my permobile wheelchair becoming a symbol of my new, uncompromising reality, as the people who had treated me like a disposable bank account were stripped of every luxury they had stolen from my sacrifice. My mother's frantic phone calls went unanswered as she realized that the society women she had spent decades trying to impress wouldn't even return a text message once the 4K footage of the sliding door lubricant became the most talked about video in the state. The injustice that had simmered for years, the quiet resentment of the invisible daughter who worked while the golden child played, was finally balanced by the cold, hard weight of consequences that no amount of Grant family charm could deflect. I was still facing months of grueling physical therapy and the permanent presence of titanium rods in my spine, but the mental burden of their betrayal had been replaced by the tactical satisfaction of a mission successfully executed to its terminal phase. Family isn't a safety net when the people holding the ropes are the ones who sharpen the knives, and as I watched the sun rise over the Savannah River from my own modest, accessible apartment, I realized that I didn't need their blood-stained mahogany to feel like I had finally come home. The legacy of the Grants was now a cautionary tale whispered in the very country clubs they were no longer allowed to enter, a reminder that the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface even when it is polished over with industrial-grade silicone and buried under layers of expensive lies. I was no longer a victim of their narrative but the sole author of my own, a captain who had survived the front lines and the home front, proving that the most dangerous weapon in any theater of war is a woman with nothing left to lose and the evidence to prove why. I won, and the victory was not merely measured by the legal resolution of a lawsuit that eventually settled for a staggering $1.2 million, but by the absolute and uncompromising reclamation of my own freedom from a bloodline that had treated my life as a line item on a balance sheet. I took that settlement money, every hard-fought cent of it, and liquidated every remaining tie to the humid, suffocating atmosphere of Savannah, Georgia, to purchase a fully accessible state-of-the-art smart home in a quiet high-altitude suburb of Colorado where the air is crisp and the shadows of the past cannot reach me. This house is a masterpiece of modern engineering, featuring wide hallways of reclaimed oak lowered granite countertops, and a voice-activated Lutron lighting system that responds to my commands with more loyalty than my own sister ever did. I systematically blocked every single one of their phone numbers, their social media profiles, and their secondary email accounts, effectively erasing the Grant name from my digital and physical reality with the same clinical precision I used to manage million-dollar supply chains in Poland. The final communication I ever afforded them was a cold, certified letter drafted by Marcus Thorne's office, a document that stated in no uncertain terms that any further attempt at contact, whether for a plea for forgiveness or a request for financial assistance, would be met with an immediate and permanent restraining order and a criminal harassment filing. I had a new family now, a tribe built not on the fragile and treacherous foundation of shared DNA, but on the unbreakable bond of shared service and genuine sacrifice. My brothers and sisters in arms, the men and women I had served with in the Army Logistics Corps, and the fellow veterans who had actually occupied the plastic chairs in my hospital room while my biological parents were busy worrying about the finish on their deck, were the ones who truly understood the meaning of the word loyalty. They were the ones who helped me navigate the grueling months of physical therapy, the ones who cheered when I regained partial sensation in my left thigh, and the ones who helped me move my belongings into a life where I was no longer a disappointing daughter or a convenient bank account. Samantha's 4K betrayal and my parents' complicity had been the ultimate test of my tactical endurance, but standing on my own balcony now, looking out at the jagged peaks of the Rockies, I realized that the mission of my life had finally reached its objective. I am Captain Melissa Grant, a woman who survived a war zone only to be broken by her own family, yet I am the one who emerged from the wreckage with my dignity intact and my future secured. The $1.2 million was simply a down payment on the peace of mind I had earned by cutting out the cancer of their influence, leaving them to rot in the ruins of their own social reputation back in a city that now knows exactly who they are. Family isn't about who is there at the celebration. It is about who stays in the trenches when the ground gives way beneath you, and as I watch the sun dip below the horizon, I know that for the first time in 29 years, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The mission is complete, the perimeter is secure, and I have finally found the home that I was always meant to build for myself. Today I can walk again, though the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other is a daily testament to the high-tech engineering of a $4,000 custom carbon fiber brace that fits snugly against my calf and the faint, jagged scar that runs like a topographic map down my spine. The slight limp in my stride is a permanent rhythmic reminder of the afternoon the Brazilian Ipewood deck became a battlefield, yet I carry it with more pride than I ever carried the approval of a family that saw me as a subsidized convenience rather than a daughter. My life has shifted from the rigid hierarchy of the Army Logistics Corps to the high-stakes world of global corporate consulting, where I now manage international supply chains for a Fortune 500 firm, earning more in a single fiscal quarter than Samantha will likely see in an entire year of her desperate post-scandal existence. I spend my days in a sun-drenched home office in Colorado, surrounded by the quiet hum of high-end air filtration and the crisp, mountain air that feels light years away from the heavy, deceptive humidity of Savannah. From my height-adjustable mahogany desk, I coordinate the movement of goods across 3 continents, applying the same tactical precision to logistics that I used to dismantle the Grant family's carefully constructed facade of country club perfection. I look at the life I have built from the shards of that broken Waterford crystal and the wreckage of my former identity, and I realize with a crystalline, cold-blooded clarity that sometimes you truly have to lose your footing on a rigged floor to finally find the path that was meant for you all along. The $2.4 million lawsuit and the ensuing settlement provided the capital, but it was the act of cutting the cord to a toxic golden child and her enabling parents that provided the actual foundation for my survival. Samantha is now a footnote in a public record, a cautionary tale of greed and misplaced entitlement, while I am the architect of a reality where every dollar in my bank account is mine and every person in my inner circle has earned their place through loyalty rather than blood. My spine may be fused with titanium, but my resolve has never been more flexible or more resilient, allowing me to navigate a world that no longer requires me to apologize for my strength or my success. The mission that began in the back of an ambulance on Abercorn Street has reached its final, successful conclusion, leaving me with a profound sense of peace that can only come from knowing you have held the people who tried to break you fully and legally accountable. Family is not an obligation to endure abuse, it is a choice to stand together, and by choosing to walk away from the people who oiled the floor beneath me, I finally stepped into the person I was always meant to be. I am no longer the daughter who pays for the roof while being left out in the rain. I am a survivor, a captain, and a woman who knows exactly what her life is worth down to the very last cent. My path is now clear, unobstructed by the shadows of my sister's envy or my mother's social anxiety, leading toward a horizon that I own entirely. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't the $1 million settlement or the ruin of their reputations, but the quiet, steady sound of my own footsteps echoing through a home where I am finally, undeniably safe.